In the still, humid air of the Deep South, Constance found herself grinding through yet another exhausting graveyard shift. The diner's clock glared back at her, 2:03 a.m. Her sneakers, worn and frayed, barely protected her aching feet as she moved between tables, her body heavy with fatigue. The bitter scent of coffee brewed behind her, but it did nothing to clear the haze of old grease that hung thick in the room. It was a quiet night, the hum of the fluorescent lights steady and dull, when the diner door creaked open, and the chime rang out, shattering the stillness. An elderly black man shuffled in slowly. His clothes were tattered, his posture slumped, and his eyes seemed to be glued to the floor. Constance noticed how the overnight regulars reacted. The trekker, now on his fourth refill, glanced up with disinterest. The couple in the corner, locked in a silent, bitter argument, shot the man a look of disgust. Whispers spread through the diner, carried on the steam rising from half-filled coffee mugs. Eyes followed the man as if he didn't belong there, and Constance could feel the unspoken tension in the air. She approached him with her best practiced smile, the one she had perfected through countless long nights just like this one. When she asked if he preferred to sit at the counter or at a booth, he only asked for a cup of black coffee. As she poured it, a familiar pang of pity stirred in her chest. She knew it shouldn't matter, but she also knew all too well that it did. The man didn't fit here. His skin color, his appearance, everything about him seemed out of place in this dingy little diner in the middle of nowhere. Her gut twisted with the knowledge that showing him even a scrap of kindness might cost her more than she bargained for. As she returned to the counter, the stares from the other patrons bored into her, urging her to ignore him, to let him be. But something rebellious stirred inside her. She glanced at the untouched plates on the counter, half-eaten pancakes, leftover bacon from an order no one would miss. Without overthinking it, she grabbed the food and brought it to him, adding the bacon as a final gesture of defiance. "It's on the house," she said softly. The man's weary shoulders straightened just a little, surprise flashing across his face. He settled into a cracked vinyl booth and began to eat, slowly, carefully, as if savoring each bite. With each piece of food he swallowed, the tension in his body seemed to melt away, and for a moment, Constance felt a warm sense of satisfaction spread through her too. It wasn't much, just some leftovers, but in that small act, she found a quiet victory. A brief moment of defiance against the weary, judgmental world around her. As he finished the last bite of bacon, the man slid his plate aside and looked at her, his eyes now clear and grateful. He told her that kindness like hers was rare these days. Then, almost hesitantly, he reached into the pocket of his tattered coat and pulled out a crumpled $100 bill, sliding it across the counter along with a faded business card. "For your trouble," he murmured in a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper. "I'll be back." And with that, he stood and disappeared out the door into the night. For a moment, Constance stared at the bill in disbelief. $100? And why would a homeless man have a business card? Her curiosity got the better of her, and she held the card up to the dim light, squinting to read the faded text. The name on the card sent a chill through her body. Dr. Lawrence Carter. The name stirred something in her memory, something she hadn't thought about in years. A cold realization washed over her as she remembered his face, a face she had seen before years ago on the news. Carter had been a fugitive, his mugshot plastered on every television screen and storefront window when she was still a child. He wasn't just a man down on his luck. He was a criminal, accused of turning what was supposed to be a peaceful protest into a bloodbath. The city still remembered him as the man responsible for chaos, destruction, and fear, leaving a trail of violence in his wake. Constance's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the card, her fingers trembling. She hadn't just served an old man a free meal, she had just helped a fugitive. Panic surged inside her. Why had he left her this card? Was it a threat? Would he really come back? And what if the police found out? Would they think she was involved somehow? As the night dragged on, fear gnawed at her. Every shadow outside the diner seemed to take the shape of Carter's stooped figure, and every sound became the distant wail of sirens. But the hours passed, and he didn't return. By the time her shift neared its end, her nerves were frayed. The first of the morning regulars began to trickle in, and Constance forced herself to keep going, plastering on her usual smile and pouring cup after cup of coffee. But beneath the surface, her fear simmered, growing with every passing moment. When her break finally came, Constance slumped into a booth in the back and fished the card out of her pocket. It felt heavier now, as if the name on it carried the weight of everything she had tried to forget. Dr. Lawrence Carter. The name burned in her mind, dragging up memories she hadn't touched in years. She remembered snippets from history textbooks in school, old black-and-white documentaries her father used to watch. Carter hadn't always been a fugitive. He had once been a professor, a civil rights leader, a firebrand who had stood at the front lines of protests in the 1960s. But then everything had gone wrong. The protests turned violent, and the law came down hard on him. His mugshot, the one that haunted her memory, was a constant reminder of the city's darkest days. Suddenly, the phone at the diner rang, its loud, persistent sound slicing through the quiet. Constance usually ignored the old rotary phone, but this time its relentless ringing only heightened her anxiety. With shaking hands, she answered. On the other end of the line was Detective Eleanor Barnes from the Mobile Police Department. Her voice was calm, but her words sent a fresh wave of panic through Constance. The detective said they needed to speak with her about a man named Lawrence Carter. An informant had tipped them off that he had been in the diner during the early hours of the morning. As the detective spoke, the noise of the diner faded away, leaving only the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The clattering of plates and the low murmur of customers fell into silence. Constance's mind raced, the weight of what she had done crashing down on her. She promised the detective she would come to the station after her shift, but her hands still shook as she hung up the phone. She had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same again. The police station was nothing like Constance had imagined after watching endless crime shows. Instead of the grim, flickering lights and cold interrogation rooms she had expected, Detective Barnes's office was surprisingly neat, almost too ordinary for the weight of what was happening inside. The detective herself, a woman in her mid-40s, had a stern, no-nonsense appearance. Her short hair cropped close, and her sharp eyes seemed to pierce right through Constance, as if seeing more than just her outward appearance. After a quick, formal thank you for coming in, Detective Barnes wasted no time and got straight to the point. She wanted to talk about Lawrence Carter. Constance began to recount everything that had happened that night, her words tumbling out. But when she finished, the silence in the room became almost unbearable, thick and heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on her. Then Detective Barnes broke the silence, her voice cold and steady as she asked if Constance understood what she had done. She had helped a fugitive. The weight of those words settled in Constance's chest like a stone, and as the questioning dragged on, she felt as though she was being peeled open, layer by layer, exposed to this unrelenting detective. Guilt, fear, and a strange mix of sympathy battled within her. Could the frail, tired old man she had met really be the same Lawrence Carter the world was hunting? The man the news described as dangerous and wanted? It seemed impossible. The detective's stern demeanor shifted just slightly, her face softening as she leaned in a little closer. She told Constance that she understood she had been caught in the middle of a much larger situation than she had realized, and that she could leave now. But she left her with one stern instruction. If Carter ever returned to the diner, she had to call the police. The $100 bill he'd left behind raised too many questions, suggesting he either had access to illegal money or was being supported by people who knew exactly where to find him. The thought made Constance shudder. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a plate of food for a tired old man, had somehow spiraled into a mess far beyond her control. As she stumbled out of the police station, her thoughts swirled like a storm, each one louder and more frantic than the last. Could she really betray Carter? What would she do if he showed up again? Would she warn him or turn him in? The diner, which had always been her safe haven, now felt like a cage. She tried to distract herself with work, serving customers and listening to their idle chatter, but it was impossible to focus. The whispers had already started. People were talking about Carter, about what had happened all those years ago. Some believed he had deliberately incited violence at the protest, stirring people up until they lashed out. Others thought he had been just like her, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, blamed for something that had spiraled out of control. Constance had no idea what to believe. She'd been too young to remember much about the protest, and what little she had learned in school was vague, distant. If she had been older, would she have taken his side, or would she have believed the authorities, like so many others had? The memory of Carter's weary, haunted eyes stayed with her. There was only one way she would ever find peace, and that was by getting the truth directly from him. She needed answers. That evening, after a particularly long and restless shift, Constance slipped out the back of the diner and set out to find him. It wasn't going to be easy, but she knew she had to try. The streets of Mobile weren't friendly to the homeless, but they were far from invisible. As she moved through the city's underbelly, the sheer number of people living on the edges of society shocked her. She asked questions, trying to trace Carter's steps, but most of the people she spoke to responded with wary glances or shrugs of indifference. Just as she was about to give up, her eyes caught on a figure huddled beneath a worn, discarded tarp in an alley. Her heart raced, and without thinking, she called out softly, "Carter." Her voice barely carried over the noise of the street, but the figure stirred. Slowly, the man sat up, and as his face came into view, recognition dawned in his eyes, though it was tinged with wariness and a guarded suspicion. "You shouldn't be here," Carter rasped, his voice rough and tired. "This isn't a place for someone like you." But Constance wasn't about to back down. She had come too far, and there was too much at stake. She told him everything, the police questioning her, the doubts that gnawed at her, the burning need for the truth. Carter let out a long, weary sigh, as if the weight of the world was pressing on his shoulders. His next words cut deep. "What will you do with the truth, child?" he asked softly. "Sell it? Use it against me? Or bury it like they did?" Constance shook her head, trying to make him understand. The police thought he had bribed her for her silence, that the $100 bill was a payoff. She didn't know what to believe, and that's why she was here. She needed to know, once and for all. Was he guilty? Had they framed him? For a long moment, Carter said nothing. His gaze dropped to his hands, worn and scarred from a lifetime of struggle, yet there was still something gentle about them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and resigned. "Doesn't matter if I'm innocent," he said, his tone bitter. "The system made its decision a long time ago. In their eyes, I'm already guilty. That's the only truth that counts." The silence between them was thick, filled with the unspoken pain of a man who had been broken by forces far greater than himself. Constance sat there, feeling more lost and confused than ever, the weight of Carter's words pressing down on her. After what felt like an eternity, Carter finally broke the silence again. "They framed me," he said quietly. "Not the cops. No, it was people far more powerful than that. People who don't get their hands dirty, but they've got blood on them just the same. They made it look like I had lost control, like I had turned a peaceful protest into a riot." His voice grew hard as he spoke, the old fire of the revolutionary in him flaring up once again. Constance asked him why they would do that, why they would go to such lengths to destroy him. Carter's eyes gleamed with the fierce passion of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Because I spoke the truth," he said simply. "And the truth is dangerous when it threatens those in power. I rallied people who had nothing, people the system had failed, and that scared them. They couldn't buy me, so they destroyed me instead." He leaned back, the fire in his eyes dimming as he spoke of how they had torn apart his reputation, ruined his family. But through it all, they had never managed to extinguish the fire inside him. Constance sat in stunned silence. The truth she had come looking for was far more complicated and far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. He spoke of hiding in plain sight, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike, not with violence, but with the unwavering force of truth. Then, a deafening crack ripped through the air, shattering the fragile stillness. Constance knew at once that it wasn't gunfire. No. This sound was heavier, more menacing. She turned swiftly, her heart pounding, only to see figures dressed in black swarming the camp. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they moved with the chilling precision of a well-organized machine. Carter's voice echoed through the chaos, shouting for her to run, but Constance couldn't move. She stood frozen, watching in stunned horror as the cold brutality unfolded before her eyes. Tents were ripped open without mercy. What little the people had was thrown carelessly into the dirt. Cries of fear and pain were abruptly silenced by rough, unfeeling hands. "Constance, they followed you!" Carter's voice cut through her daze, filled with urgency. His words seemed to echo in her ears as the reality of the situation crashed down around her. "They're here for me. Go!" His shove jolted her into motion, and she began to run. Blindly, she raced forward, her feet pounding along the dirt paths as the terrifying sounds of gunfire and muffled screams spurred her on. She broke through the thick undergrowth, pushing herself harder as the distant city lights flickered like a dream just out of reach. Her breath tore at her lungs, every gasp a painful reminder of her fear. Just as she stumbled onto a cracked, abandoned sidewalk, a scream escaped her lips. It was her own. Pain tore through her shoulder like fire, a violent shockwave that knocked her to the ground. The world around her spun wildly, and then everything faded into black. When Constance finally regained consciousness, she found herself lying under the harsh glare of hospital lights. The memory of her own scream still echoed faintly in her ears, and each breath she took brought fresh waves of pain. Her arm throbbed inside an uncomfortable cast. A figure loomed at her bedside. Detective Barnes, her expression grim. "They got Carter," Barnes said softly, the words barely registering through the fog in Constance's mind. "Who?" Constance croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who got Carter?" The detective didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled business card. Constance recognized it immediately, the faded ink, Carter's name written neatly on the front. But it wasn't the card itself that made her blood run cold. It was what was scrawled hastily across the back. One name: Senator Winslow. Constance's heart sank as she stared at the name. Senator Winslow. She knew exactly who he was. A powerful man who had long been a master of deception. He was a smiling face plastered on every billboard, a man who prided himself on his pillar of the community reputation. But Constance had seen through that veneer. She knew him for what he truly was: a bigot, a liar, and a ruthless manipulator. The hastily written name on the back of Carter's card held a kind of power that was cold and lethal, more dangerous than any weapon. Detective Barnes watched her closely, something like respect flickering in her eyes. "The fight never really ends, Constance," she said softly. "It just changes shape." 6 months later, Constance still carried those words with her. The town had changed, and so had she. She no longer worked at the diner. Her days were now filled with interviews, speeches hurriedly written in notebooks, and a fierce determination that reflected the spirit of the man she had once admired. Carter's name, once smeared and tarnished, had been restored. Through her tireless efforts and with the backing of Detective Barnes, it had become a rallying cry, a symbol of defiance and change. The truth came out in pieces, but it was enough. Carter had been working with the police in secret for years, trying to expose the corruption that had poisoned the town. He had always suspected Senator Winslow, the man behind the smear campaign that had ruined his reputation. But until recently, he hadn't had the proof. The attack on the homeless camp had been the senator's mistake, one that left enough clues for Detective Barnes to follow the trail right to his door. The truth was undeniable, and the pressure Constance had applied through rallies, media appearances, and petitions to the Department of Justice had finally paid off. Senator Winslow's power was shattered. He had been impeached, his network of corruption exposed for all to see. Criminal charges were pending, and the days of the narcissistic, bigoted senator and his cronies were quickly coming to an end. The morning was bright and clear as Constance stood before the prison gates, her heart heavy with anticipation. The gates creaked open and Carter emerged, older and thinner than she remembered, his eyes etched with exhaustion. Yet despite everything he had endured, his spirit remained unbroken. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that brief, silent exchange, a promise passed between them. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.